everyone, welcome to part 3 of my demand and supply series. So this is part of my economics basics series, and I've already covered the first 2 parts. The first video in this series looked at demand and supply from the market perspective, as in one market for one particular good, and that was bananas, not individual sellers. Whereas the second one looked at it from the individual's perspective, managing their own demand and also managing the price and quantities that they want to buy based on their own demand and their own preferences. And this third part, we're going to be looking at it from the seller's perspective, individual seller's perspective. So again, it could be focused on one industry, and this is what we've been doing, this is what we've been doing the whole series so far. So we'll be looking on one particular seller, in this case one seller of bananas. You can do it with anything, you can do it with coconuts or whatever, you know, I did coconuts earlier on, so do bananas. So alright, and as I mentioned with the previous 2 videos, we're looking at again from a partial equilibrium perspective, not from general equilibrium perspective. So again, we're focusing on one good and the effect on one market. General equilibrium is going to be a little bit more complicated, not going to be part of this economic series, but be something that I'm going to be looking at quite a bit later on. So I'll let you know if you're interested in general equilibrium stuff. We'll be touching that a little bit later. Alright, so what do we have in terms of businesses? So they tend to either be leaders or followers in terms of setting price. So in a sense, are they a price setter or are they a price taker? Are they able to set their own price in a sense? Are they big enough to actually influence the market themselves? Or are they fairly small and just have to accept what they're given? So if you're looking at small business, generally fairly small, doesn't always have to be. In this case, actually, we call it perfect competition. So what is perfect competition? That is where the price is actually set by the market. Individual firms have no influence on the price whatsoever. And it could be because you have lots and lots of little sellers, so you can't influence the price, or it could be because the product is completely homogeneous. Every single item sold by every single business in that industry sells the exact same thing, identical in every way. So that would be your perfect competition. And what does that look like? So I've got it here, a little graph showing you here. So what we've got is your price, which is your demand, which is also your average and your marginal revenue, and that stays constant at any quantities, regardless of the quantity. And also what we got here is your marginal cost. So what is the marginal cost? That is the additional cost of producing additional units of something. So you'd start off with your fixed cost, and then you'd have variable costs for all of your. But how marginal differences is actually looking at your differences between your total costs at each day. So what's your total cost of producing 4, total cost of producing 5, 6, and so on, and the differences between those, that is your marginal cost. And where's your average cost, your average total cost? So that is the total cost altogether, just divided by the number of outputs. And we've got an interesting relationship between marginal cost and average total cost. So at your lowest point of your average total cost is actually where your marginal cost intersects your average cost. So when the marginal cost is below, and effectively that's pulling your average cost down, keeps going down, and eventually your marginal cost starts to increase, but your average cost is still decreasing. Bear in mind, you've also got fixed cost, variable costs, and then once your marginal cost is actually higher, every additional cost that's higher than the average cost is actually pulling your average cost up. So that's how you get that U shape. And in the case of perfect competition, it's actually the bottom, the very bottom of your average cost, your lowest average cost is where you would be producing. So we'd assume that all the firms within a perfect competition structure would have the same price structure. So they would all actually have that same cost and have the same price. If for whatever reason, if you're not competitive enough, you can't get those costs down to what the rest of the market is, you wouldn't be able to produce anything because you'd actually be selling at a loss. So in a sense that if you're in perfect competition, we earn what we call normal profits. So that is basically your profits just cover your costs. When we talk about costs, that would be your opportunity costs as well included. So doing alternative activities in that. Alright, so let's just have a look here at what our costs look like in the table. So let's say we've got a fixed cost of $10. In a sense, that wouldn't change. Now our marginal cost is the additional cost every single time, which is your difference between your total costs. So for example, you have 16, so that is your variable plus your fixed cost gives you 20, and then 16. Then if you go to your next unit produced, so that would give you 21. So that again would be your total cost plus the variable cost of the 2 units. So it's 5.5 each. So that would give you 11 in variable cost plus your 10. That gives you 21. And your marginal is a difference. That's 21 minus 16. And we keep going until you'll find that you get to your lowest point of your average cost, which is roughly, in this case, an output of 7 or 8. And that is actually where your marginal cost and your average cost intersect. Alright, so I'm just going to express this in terms of our demand and supply curves now. So I've got it here. It's a little bit different from how I described it just now, where you actually had a flat demand curve, since you can't influence price. But I've got it here as a flat supply curve, because they're fixed to that particular supply, in the sense that is at one point where your marginal cost equals your average cost equals your price. And then the price, this is the market price for consumers. And in a perfect competition, your consumers actually still get consumer surplus, because there's still people willing to buy things. Like a good example is your produce stuff, like we mentioned about bananas, or maybe rice is actually a good one. Rice, homogeneous rice. So in a sense that we assume that the rice is all the same, there's very little variation in rice. So there'll be people that will be willing to pay more than the price, and they still get that consumer surplus. But there's no producer surplus, in the sense that they are selling at their cost, at the total opportunity cost of producing, so you don't get a producer surplus with perfect competition. So let's now take a look at some market structures where the firms actually have some say in terms of what the price might be. And there's a few of those actually. There's monopolistic competition, well, in the short run anyway. There's an oligopoly, and there's also a monopoly. So what are these market forms? So a monopoly would be just one seller, so they basically control the whole market, and they have quite a say over what the price is. And normally they will be, almost definitely would be considered a price setter. Oligopoly also has quite a bit of power. That's not just one firm, it could be several firms, but they'd often be working together in terms of price setting. So there'd be a combination. So you may have, like, let's say 20 big firms or whatever form an oligopoly, and they work together in terms of price setting. Then there's monopolistic competition. That is somewhat similar to perfect competition. You may have many, many small firms, but what's different with monopolistic competition is the products being sold by these firms are a little bit different from each other. There's some variation. So you can actually vary the price because it's not exactly the same. So like take for example watches and all. You may think, no, all watches, they're not all the same. So you could have like a Rolex watch would be a lot more than a Swatch watch, for example, or a Casio watch, and all a little bit different. So offer different functionality and also different quality and things like that. So let's look at it in terms of now the price setter and how they respond to the market. So we looked at, before we looked at in terms of costs, we looked at marginal costs and we looked at average costs, and how marginal cost equals average cost equals the price. And there will be basically no profit, so we have to call it normal profits. So with a price setter, let's say in the case, let's talk about monopoly for example, they actually can set the price, and they would set that price to whatever gives them the most amount of money, which earns them the highest, what we call supernormal profits. As you can see here from the diagram, it actually equates their marginal revenue with their marginal cost. So what do we mean by that? So that is, so the revenue that's bringing in, the additional revenue of selling each additional item is greater than the cost of producing each additional item. And as long as that's the case, then they'll keep producing. But once the cost of producing that additional item becomes greater than the marginal revenue that's being brought in, then they would cease production. And that could actually be at a point that's significantly lower than what it would be in a perfect competition, because most of the time, almost guaranteed, you would not have the same number produced, because your average cost curve is actually still on the downward slope, still going down, because your marginal cost has still got to go up to that level. So that's, in a sense, you've got a monopoly power, and that would mean as well that your consumers would not have as much consumer surplus, but instead you'd have a producer with producer surplus. And And why do we get that, in a sense? So what causes this price setting? As I mentioned before, it's different from different market structures. So like monopoly, for example, how do you get monopoly power? It could be through regulation. The government could state that there's only one producer for this and they're protected, and then their other producers are restricted for entering because of what the government has put in place. It could also be because the assets are very, very expensive. It's actually, only one company can actually afford to pay all that. Because, for example, you could be looking at a train system. You may only have one company that operates the trains, and it says, and they have a monopoly on that because the infrastructure is very, very expensive, very, very high fixed costs, and that blocks any other entrants. So if there were entrants, then they would have to just be operating using that and have to pay for that. So potentially you could have a monopoly there as well. And also as well, it could be a competitive advantage. For example, it could be patents and things like that. You could have a patent on something that others can't use, so that restricts access as well. Or it could be because you've got a superior product that others can't emulate. Or you could even have such a large market share that other firms can't get in on that because they'll be pushed out, and you can actually have lower prices, preventing any other entrants into the market. Alright, so I'm just going to summarize now what we've covered so far in this three-part series. So we've looked at it from the market as a whole, the market for a particular good, the demand and supply. That is fairly basic level. It got a little bit more complicated when we looked at individual decisions, and also looking at in terms of diminishing margin utility, and at the point where you would stop buying a particular thing and maybe switch to an item because the utility has fallen. We've also looked at that from individual sellers in terms of how they can actually may have control over their own price if it's a monopolistic competition or a monopoly, or they may not have any control whatsoever if it's a perfect competition scenario where they just have to take the price that they're given, and also you can't make supernormal profits out of that either. So that basically takes me to the end of the demand series for now. I'm maybe adding a few more videos later on. All of this, is, bear in mind, has been at the micro level, and it's also been partial equilibrium level as well. So not looking at general equilibrium, we're not looking at it in terms of the macro, because again, you can have demand and supply at the macro level as well. So we'd be looking at things in terms of government expenditure, total consumption, imports and exports and all that stuff. So that's not going to be covered within this series, but we'll look at that at a later time. Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button. If you'd like to see more videos, I have many more series running. I still got the economics basics series that's going to continue afterwards as well. Hit the subscribe button, as well as vegan economics and a few cost benefit analysis stuff as well coming through. And maybe even a few more games and models and things like that we come out in future videos. So thanks for paying attention. Oh, and I've got my t-shirt on, if you haven't noticed. This here, you can see. Oh, there we go. This says Veg Out. This is actually my sister's new YouTube channel that she's just started. So if you want to subscribe to that channel as well, just go over to the Veg Out channel and subscribe, and that's got a lot of interesting stuff coming along there as well, and a lot of vegan things and vegan cooking and things like that. So if you're interested in all that sort of thing, because I do vegan videos too, a little bit different, looking at it from the economic perspective, just be looking at it in terms of food. So check out this. Check out this channel as well. Okay, thank you very much.